Hare Krishna, everyone. Please accept my humble obeisances. All glories to Shri Guru and Shri Gauranga, or Dandavat Pranams, depending on which mat you're in, which Sangha you're in the Hare Krishna family. I want to talk a bit today. I want to take us back to the 1930s again. I've talked a bit about the 1930s on this Facebook page as part of my research into the history of Gaudiya Vaishnavism in the UK. Today I want to go back again and talk in a bit more detail about Daisy Bowtell. Daisy Bowtell is probably the most well-known of those 1930s converts to Gaudiya Vaishnavism. She was the one that passed away in 1981 and donated her house to the Gaudiya Mission UK. If you go to Willesden now in London, you will find the house that Daisy Bowtell donated to the Gaudiya Mission UK. And today I'm talking a bit more about Daisy Bowtell because some more information has come to light about her. I've talked a bit before, or I've written a bit on this page before about whether Daisy Bowtell was actually really a disciple of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Sarasvati Thakur. I've pinned the dates into this Facebook page before, that Britain's first Hare Krishna movement was from April 1933 to October 1937. There's lots of information about what the devotees did in London during those years, what they got up to, and we're aware of a number of Western people being initiated. So some of the names, and I've mentioned some of this before, but I'll mention it again. Some of the devotees that were initiated back in the 1930s were Arnold Corbluth. He was the first Englishman to be initiated in England into Gaudiya Vaishnavism on the 1st of October 1933. And we also know that probably around the same time, possibly the same day, an elderly lady called Hilda Corbell was also initiated into the Gaudiya Vaishnava Hare Krishna family at the same time. We also know that Ernst George Schlusch, so he was the German devotee that came over in late 30s, early 40s to associate with the devotees. He came over from Germany, and he did receive initiation in England, in London, around the late 1933, early 1934. Now, we're also of there's also a very strong school of thought that Daisy Bowtell was also a disciple of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Sarasvati Thakur. As I've said before, she is the most well-known of those early converts from the 30s. In his book, I've got a copy here, Sri Bhaktisiddhanta Vaibhava, Bhaktivikash Swami suggests that actually Daisy Bowtell wasn't a disciple of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Sarasvati Thakur, based on the dates of the things that happened. So we know that I think around, according to the Western calendar, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Sarasvati Thakur left around the 1st of February, or it was before that. It was January, February that Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Sarasvati Thakur left in 1937, and in a letter written by Daisy Bowtell, which I have a copy here today, which is why I'm really excited. I'm going to read that letter. In a letter, it suggests of her, in hers dated the 7th of February 1937, that she's not initiated at that point. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Sarasvati Thakur had left the planet at that point, at the time of writing that letter. So that's a heavy indication to say that actually she wasn't a disciple of his. So how do we access some of this information? How do I have a copy of this letter? Well, there was a publication produced by the Gaudiya Mat called the Gaudiya Magazine, or the Gaudiya Magazine. And there were thousands of copies produced between 1918 and 1938 over a 20-year period. And often that magazine, which was kind of like Back to Godhead in ISKCON, it was a magazine that kind of rallied the troops. It talked about spiritual issues, it talked about Krishna consciousness, and it gave updates on terms of what preaching activities were happening in India and also happening in Europe, because there were preaching activities happening. And I'm very grateful to Sundar Gopal Prabhu, who works at the Bhaktivedanta Research Institute in Calcutta, who's my source of information there. And if I ask him to send me some information, first I have to give some dates, because there's thousands of articles and they're mostly all written in Bengal. And I have to give him some clear dates as to information I'm looking for. And he will send me the information, which is really, really kind of him. So I asked him to find a copy of this letter dated the 7th of February 1937 that was written by Daisy Bowtell. And I'm going to read the letter to you now. Now, I've written an article about 1930s and the Hare Krishnas in the 1930s. In terms of what was happening and things in a chronological order. Now, obviously Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Sarasvati Thakur never actually visited Britain. As far as I know, he never left India. And so therefore it was quite impossible for him to be physically present to initiate his disciples in London. He never travelled. And he held the traditional Gaudiya Vaishnava view that, if your guru is present, then your guru should do the initiations. There are some exceptions to that, and we know that in ISKCON and other Gaudiya Vaishnava groups as well. Because, though, he couldn't travel abroad or didn't travel abroad, he would give special exemptions. He would send some beads to London. He would send a new name on a piece of paper to London. And he would ask one of his already initiated disciples to initiate on his behalf. So, just to be clear, this is not a Ritvik ceremony, that's something else. But because he couldn't get to London, he would ask one of his existing disciples, that were already initiated by him, to initiate on his behalf. Now, most of the initiations between 1933 onwards were carried out by a sannyasi called Bhakti Pradeep Tirtha Maharaj. So Bhakti Pradeep Tirtha Maharaj was one of those three original devotees who came over to London in April 1933, sent by Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Sarasvati Thakur. Now, just a very short, interesting fact about Bhakti Pradeep Tirtha Maharaj. He was actually a Diksha disciple of Bhaktivinoda Thakur. Therefore, we can say with confidence that Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur, going back even further in the Acharya line, one of his disciples actually did set foot on British soil, Bhakti Pradeep Tirtha Maharaj. Bhakti Pradeep Tirtha Maharaj, though, is a sannyas disciple of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Sarasvati Thakur. So, as a sannyasi, he was asked to carry a number of the initiations in London in the 1930s. However, this is where question marks start to arise, because Bhakti Pradeep Tirtha Maharaj left London in 1934. He left around September 1934 after a year and a half in London to return to India. And Daisy Bowtell was not initiated until after the 7th of February 1937. So some 2.5 years had passed. So one theory was, which I think I can dispute, is that she was initiated by Bhakti Pradeep Tirtha Maharaj. We now know that's not possible because he was physically present in London at the time in 1937. Okay, take a breath. I've talked on this page before about 5 disciples of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Sarasvati Thakur, 5 Indian-bodied disciples coming to London in the 1930s. We know the first 3, Bhakti Pradeep Tirtha Maharaj, Samvedana Prabhu, and Hridaya Bon Maharaj. We then know there was a 4th that came around 1934, Rasbahari, Brahmachari, and then we know there was a 5th disciple called Bhakti Saranga Goswami Maharaj. He was sent in October 1936, and he pretty much did a year's sabbatical, and he went back to India in October 1937. Now, before I read out this letter and shed some strong light on Daisy Bowtell, Bhaktivikas Swami, in his book, Volume 2, this is a must-read by any devotees in the UK in terms of the history of the Hare Krishna movement, he tells us that in October 1936, Goswami Maharaj was sent to England, being designated as missionary in charge of preaching in Europe and America. He never got to America, but he did get to Europe. So he was designated by his spiritual master, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Sarasvati Thakur, as the missionary in charge of preaching in Europe and America. So the Gaudiya Mission UK is the oldest Hare Krishna group in the UK. It had already existed for 30 years in London before ISKCON was established in 1968 in London. In 1969, ISKCON UK was registered with the Charity Commission. So for some 30 years already, the Gaudiya Mission UK had already existed. And officially, according to the Gaudiya Mission UK, if you go to their temple in Willesden, Daisy Bowtell is recognised as a disciple of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Sarasvati Thakur. It says that on their website. It says that on her plaque in the temple. Her initiated name, by the way, was Vinod Vani Devi Dasi. That was her initiated name. So I have pieced the dates together, recognising that she cannot be a disciple of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Sarasvati Thakur. And in my book, which is not published yet, I express my own view that she's actually probably a disciple of Bhakti Saranga Goswami Maharaj. Now, I'm trying to piece it all together chronologically. In this book, written by Bhakti Goswami, it does say that Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur gave Bhakti Saranga Goswami permission to initiate one lady in London, but it doesn't give the name. And when I emailed Bhakti Goswami a while ago, or a month ago, to suggest that Maharaj, don't you think possibly the Bhakti Saranga Goswami Maharaj's disciple was actually Daisy Bowtell, he was quite enlightened by it. He hadn't pieced those two pieces of information together, and that could actually be the case. So finally, I'm going to get round to reading this letter that really, for me, fills in a lot of the gaps. Before I start reading, I just want to also point out that Bhakti Saranga Goswami Maharaj, he was also known as Aprakrita Bhakti Saranga. So, Aprakrita Bhakti Saranga. He was also known as that name. Okay. So I'm going to read out the letter. Now, the letter has been photocopied, or a photo of the letter has been taken and emailed to me. So this letter is from Daisy Srila Bowtell, dated the 7th of February, 1937. At the top, it says, it's very English. This is what I love about it. To Mr. A.B. Goswami, missionary in charge, Gaudiya Mission, London. And she's writing from her home address, which is 135 Dalston Lane in Hackney, postcode E8. Dear Mr. Goswami, so she's in England, in Hackney, and she's writing to Mr. Goswami, who's also in England. Dear Mr. And I can't read all of it out because some of it, the picture's not clear. Dear Mr. Goswami, it will give me much happiness to be the faithful servant of a faithful servant of God. God, whom I love, and to whom I am devoted. I have often longed to know someone like yourself, a true lover of the divine. You will be successful in the work you have undertaken. There is force behind your calm and composure which brings conviction. You have dignity tempered with humility, and the humility enhances the dignity. You have eloquence, and you speak like an inspired man. So she'd obviously met him already at that point, because there was no Facebook or YouTube or videos at that point. You speak like an inspired man, as though inspiration were being poured onto your mind. Oh, the infinite beauty of that address you gave on divine love. You have magnetism and all the equipment which makes an ideal teacher. This is where it starts to get a bit blurry, but I'll continue to try and read it. The spiritual training of the West has been of the direct order. Christianity and not Christianity has been given out to it. The church has mutilated Christianity. It has presented Beelzebub, which is another name for the devil. It has presented Beelzebub, hell, fire, and everlasting torment, eternal punishment for erring souls. It is presented a God who rejoices in conflicting punishment. Bitter. God, something God, all-loving and compassionate. God is God, all-loving and compassionate, all-wise, all-good, all-beautiful, all-perfect, delightful in punishing something. The church has been set to tone these things down now because hinking people reject anything to something. Okay, to turn from a religion so disgusting, seek pleasure and sink into dark, stark materialism, you have described the remainder in your letter. The churches are empty. The church crumbles. It totters. It delights me that the East, to India, Asia, is sending missionaries to the West, and I am convinced that the spirit of India is destined to lead mankind to go straight ahead and be of good cheer. There is much I wish to say to you. I can come to Gloucester House any afternoon or evening. I am hoping most earnestly that I shall be able to come on February the 11th to your lecture, The Doctrine of Salvation. With every good wish, very sincerely yours in service, Daisy Bowtell. So that's a letter from Daisy Bowtell, written to Bhaktisiddhanta Goswami Maharaj on the 7th of February 1937, indicating that she's probably not initiated at that point, but will be possibly receiving initiation at some point from Bhaktisiddhanta Goswami Maharaj. If you haven't yet watched the talk I gave, must have been a month ago, on Britain's first Hare Krishna movement, 1933 to 1937, please go to the video section on this Facebook page and scroll down and look into it. I talked for a while about what actually happened in London in the 1930s, giving various dates. And also, you will find in the photo section of this Facebook page, in photos, some photos I took of my visit to the very first Hare Krishna temple in London in the 1930s, and there's a live broadcast from outside as well, and that was in Kensington in the 1930s. So I'm going to put some more links in the description on this page. Thank you all for listening. Hare Krishna.